The dawn was young when the first smoke curled above the clearing. It rose slow and uncertain, as though the earth itself were testing breath after a long silence. Around it, the forest still whispered the old language of wind and leaves the same wild music humanity had known for 1,000 generations. But here, in this small circle of light and ash, something had changed. The people had stopped wandering. The fire was no longer a fleeting warmth beside the hunt. It was a home. In that fragile pillar of smoke, the world tilted, and the story of the village began. They were few at first, no more than a dozen souls, bone-weary from the long chase of life across endless plains. Their hands were scarred from gathering, their feet hardened from miles of riverbank and mountain trail. They carried little: stone blades, wooden bowls, dried meat, and the memory of places left behind. But what they built here was more than shelter. Each post driven into the ground, each thatched roof bound with grass, marked an unspoken vow to the soil, to the seasons, to time itself. No one said the word forever. They didn't have such a word yet, but they were beginning to live it. In the heart of the settlement, they placed the hearth, a circle of stones, filled with the breath of flame. Around it, they gathered not just for warmth, but for meaning. The fire was the oldest of their gods, and now it would watch over their nights. Beside it, the first stories of belonging took form. An elder spoke of the river spirits that guided them here. A mother traced symbols in the dust, not words, but shapes of memory. The children listened, eyes reflecting the firelight, learning not from command, but from the rhythm of living. The village was not built with stone or timber alone. It was built with memory, with the will to stay. Days bled into weeks, and the clearing changed. The soil, once a stranger, became a companion. They learned where the sun fell warmest, where the frost lingered last, where the wild grains nodded in the breeze. They bent the land gently, never breaking it. They planted seeds as one might whisper a prayer, a quiet hope to be answered in green. In the morning, smoke rose from many hearths now, and the scent of bread joined the wind. The air carried laughter, argument, and the cries of newborns. The land that had once devoured them with indifference now seemed to give back. For the first time, humanity began to belong to a place, rather than merely pass through it. Yet beneath that belonging ran a strange current, a fear older than words. The wild was still close. At night, the howls of wolves rolled through the trees, and the stars above burned cold and distant. Sometimes, a fire would go out, or a hunter would not return. They did not yet understand the fragility of what they had made. But in that tension between the warmth of the hearth and the darkness beyond life in the first village found its rhythm. Every dawn was both a victory and a gamble. And still, they rose, they built, they stayed. The earth and the axe had found one another, and civilization, though it did not yet know its name, had begun to breathe. The village's heart pulsed in rhythm with the work of its hands. Morning light spilled across the huts and fields, and from the earth itself came a song, the scrape of stone on stone, the rustle of grain, the hollow ring of clay vessels drying in the sun. Each sound was small on its own, but together they became the music of civilization being born. What once had been wild instinct, the chase, the harvest, the gathering, was now shaped by intention. Humanity, for the first time, had begun to make. From the riverbank came the potters, their fingers slick with mud, their eyes half closed in focus. They no longer shaped clay simply for survival, but for beauty. A curve of a pot might mirror the moon. A carved line might trace the path of a river, or the movement of a bird's wing. When the clay hardened in the fire's glow, it did more than hold grain or water. It held memory. Each vessel bore the mark of its maker, a whisper of identity fired into permanence. These were the first objects that would outlast their creators, silent witnesses to the people who dared to settle the restless world. Nearby, another transformation stirred, one that would forever alter humanity's bond with the land. The first fields had taken root. Where once they had scavenged wild grasses, now they cultivated rows of barley and emmer wheat. The work was relentless, breaking the soil with antler tools, driving away birds, praying to unseen gods for rain. But when the first harvest came, golden and heavy in the hand. Something sacred awakened. The villagers no longer depended solely on the gifts of chance. They had learned to command the rhythm of growth itself. To sow was to trust in tomorrow, and that trust, once planted, could not easily die. The axe, too, had changed. It was no longer just a weapon for the hunt. It was a maker's tool, a symbol of dominion and craft. From the forest, they drew timber not in fear, but with purpose. Trees fell, not as conquest, but as covenant, each one becoming the frame of a new home, the ribs of a granary, or the handle of another tool. The axe, the blade of labor and protection, had become the signature of humanity's awakening will. It cut both the earth and the past, severing the old nomadic life with every stroke. Yet in the quiet hours, when the work was done and the fires dimmed, they felt the mystery of what they were creating. The clay that once yielded to their fingers now held form beyond their control. The seeds that vanished beneath the soil returned as food, as life. And the axe, that cold edge of progress, also cut deep into the fabric of their days. For every comfort gained, a freedom was lost. The world of endless horizons, of wandering stars and untamed plains, was slipping away. The villagers did not yet know it, but they had stepped into the long current of history where every act of creation carries a shadow, and every tool of survival becomes, in time, a mirror of the soul. By now, the village had a heartbeat all its own. Steady, familiar, and utterly human. Smoke rose from the same hearths each morning. Laughter and quarrels echoed from the same paths. What began as survival had become society. Within the circle of huts, they no longer lived as a band of wanderers bound by hunger. They lived as a people, woven together by invisible threads of trust, memory, and ritual. These were the first bonds of belonging, and though unseen, they were stronger than the stones of their walls. The rhythm of the seasons became their scripture. Each year the same cycle unfolded, planting, tending, harvesting, resting, and with it the rhythm of human life. Births and deaths, unions and farewells. Around these moments, ritual took shape. A birth was marked with the lighting of a new flame from the village hearth, the child's first cry rising to mingle with the crackle of fire. Death, too, found ceremony. Bodies were laid in shallow graves near the fields, wrapped in woven mats, with offerings of food and small tools, symbols of what they would need in the world beyond. The living wept. Yet there was peace in the knowing that life was part of the same eternal cycle as the crops they sowed. With time came structure, the quiet architecture of order. Not all tasks were equal, and neither were the people who performed them. The elders became keepers of memory, telling stories that guided behavior and preserved the lessons of the past. The hunters, once the village's lifeblood, now shared authority with those who understood the secrets of the soil and the sky. And among them, one often rose above the rest not as a king, but as a voice of balance. The first leaders were not crowned. They were listened to. Their power came from wisdom, from the ability to remind others of the fragile harmony between work, land, and spirit. In the evenings, when the day's labor faded, they gathered by the fire for more than warmth. They gathered for meaning. Stories became bridges across generations. A child might hear of the ancestors who crossed great rivers, of spirits that watched over the crops, of the day the first fire was lit and never allowed to die. These tales were more than entertainment. They were lore, faith, and identity all at once. The storyteller's voice carried not just words, but the heartbeat of the entire community. Through them, the village learned who they were and who they must never forget to be. But even as the bonds grew, so did the weight of them. Where there is belonging, there is exclusion. Some were favored, others quietly cast aside. Disputes over fields, food, or affection could unravel trust in a moment. One wrong word, one broken promise could echo like a curse. In these moments, they discovered the fragility of unity, that peace was not a gift of the gods, but a craft as delicate as pottery and as easily shattered. And yet, despite it all, the village endured. For every quarrel, there was reconciliation. For every loss, renewal. Humanity had found not only how to live together, But why? Because alone, the wild still waited. Together, they could defy it. Together, they could dream. There came a time when the edges of the village began to blur, where the tame met the untamed, and the world beyond the fields whispered once more. At first, the horizon seemed a promise, a realm of endless forest and untapped soil. But soon it became a boundary, the thin line between safety and the unknown. The people had made a home, yes, but in doing so, they had drawn a circle of light in a sea of shadow. And shadows have a way of watching. The first sign was silence. The forest, once a constant chorus of birds and insects, grew still. Then came the tracks, not of deer or boar, but of feet. Strange, unfamiliar, human feet. Another people moved beyond the trees, unseen but felt. They too were survivors of the earth wanderers, perhaps who had not chosen to settle. The villagers whispered of spirits or of men who walked with ghosts. And when a child vanished one night near the stream, fear rooted itself deep. From that fear, the first fences rose. Logs driven into the soil, sharpened to a point. A boundary not of faith, but of defense. The age of walls had begun. Famine came next, as it often does when people begin to believe they have mastered the land. One summer the rains failed. The fields cracked, the river ran thin, and the grain shriveled before harvest. The air was filled with dust and prayer. People traded tools for food, hope for superstition. Offerings were left at the edge of the forest, where the old spirits were said to dwell. Bits of bread, carved stones, a child's doll. When the rains finally returned, they said the gods had been appeased. But the lesson lingered. The earth, though generous, was never truly tamed. It gave, and it could just as easily take away. And then came the strangers. One morning, smoke was seen rising on the far ridge. By dusk, men with painted faces and hard eyes stood at the boundary of the fields. They spoke no tongue the villagers knew. Some carried gifts, hides, tools, strange stones. Others carried spears. There was tension and curiosity and fear in equal measure. The encounter did not end in blood that day, but the seed was planted. The villagers had learned that beyond their fences lived others who hungered, who envied, who dreamed as they did. And with that knowledge came a truth far older than civilization. Peace is never permanent. So they built higher walls, dug deeper ditches. The axe that once felled trees for homes now shaped stakes for defense. The fire that once baked bread now hardened the tips of spears. The village had changed, not in shape, but in spirit. It was no longer only a cradle of life, it had become a fortress against it. The people began to see themselves not just as dwellers of the land, but as guardians of it, protectors of something sacred and fragile. Yet in their hearts, a quiet sorrow lingered, a nostalgia for the days when the world was open and the horizon did not divide them from the unknown. The earth had given them a home, but also the burden of fear. And as the fires of defense burned through the night, they did not yet realize they had taken the first step towards something vast and irreversible, the birth of conflict, and with it, the dawn of history. Centuries passed, though the village, in its humble way, did not count them. Time there was measured not by years, but by harvests, by floods, by the steady birth and fading of generations. The huts changed form, the fields grew broader, the paths between them more worn. What had once been a scattering of shelters around a fire had become something larger, a pattern of order written upon the earth itself. The villagers might not have called it civilization, but that is what it was. The patient layering of memory into place. Children were born who never knew the wandering life. They grew up beneath the same thatched roofs, beside the same hearths their ancestors had kindled. The wild had become a story, half believed, told by elders with faraway eyes. Yet something of that old restlessness survived in them, a spark that drove their hands to shape, to build, to reach beyond. They carved new tools of flint and bone, and later, bronze, the first gleam of metal shining like captured sunlight. The axe, once a crude edge of survival, became a masterpiece of precision and pride. It was no longer just for felling trees or defending fields. It became a symbol of mastery, of lineage, of the bond between human will and the stubborn earth beneath their feet. The dead, too, were remembered differently now. Graves became marked by stones, first simple, then carved. The villagers began to bury their ancestors in rings, facing the sunrise, as if to ensure their spirits rose with the dawn. Offerings of pottery and tools lay beside them, tokens of respect and connection. The idea of past began to take shape, the understanding that life did not simply vanish into the soil, but lingered there, waiting. In this awareness, the first roots of culture took hold. The songs that outlived their singers, the tools that outlasted their hands, the fire that was passed from hearth to hearth. Trade arrived one day like a rumor carried on the wind. Strangers appeared again, but this time, not with threats, but with promise. They brought beads, salt, and fine blades. They left with grain and pottery. In the barter of goods came the barter of stories, of ideas. The village learned that it was not alone, that beyond its horizon lay countless others like it, scattered like stars across the continent, each with their own hearth, their own gods, their own axes. From this web of contact grew something vast and invisible, the first network of human connection, the quiet dawn of civilization's shared pulse. And yet, beneath all the growth and progress, the essence remained the same. The people still rose at dawn to touch the earth, still gathered by the fire at dusk to share the day's bread. They still feared the long winter, still prayed to the soil and the sky. The axe still gleamed in the hand, the same instrument that built and destroyed, that shaped the world and scarred it. Every act of making carried its twin of loss, every victory its echo of fragility. But this is what it meant to be human, to stand between creation and ruin, between the wild and the hearth, and to keep going. Long after the first village crumbled to dust and its people became part of the very soil they once tilled, the marks of their hands endured in the furrows of the land, in the shards of pottery buried beneath centuries, in the ghost of smoke that still clings to forgotten stones. The earth and the axe, two forces bound forever, had forged the rhythm of all who came after. From that first fire in the mist rose the cities, the kingdoms, the empires. And from those ashes, us.